Yeah. We can also one. Forward. Forward. Yeah, forward. Renée asked you for that. Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's online.
Jennifer, I'm Phil.
Hi, Phil.
I've been the one
Hi,
emailing
Renee.
you.
Oh, hi.
Good. Well, kind of good.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, what do you need?
I just wanted, this is it. This is the final.
This is final deck. Okay.
Well, sorry. Phil, are you a senior? You graduated already?
No, I'm 27.
Oh, okay,
I
I'm
know,
sorry.
I know. It's just, I'm wearing whatever. You know.
Wait, Phil, you're the one I emailed with.
Yes, that's right.
Sorry, okay.
It's
I'm-
good.
I'm still waiting. now.
At least I'm still young.
Yes, you
hopefully.
are. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I get it. A lot of
How long have you been with Bank Room?
for a year now.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been. This is
Okay.
this is it. Oh yeah, it is. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Everything's great. People are super
Nice.
super nice and inspirational here. Yeah. You know, I've also had people told me I'm 40, so
What?
I'll take
Sorry.
I'll take any. This one.
So funny.
Yeah.
I just thought, I'm like, oh, look, It's a student helping it out.
We do have plenty of students helping out. Yeah,
My bad.
you're good. Alright, so it's actually a good thing so that I can wear this and people just assume I'm a student. So like it doesn't look bad.
So, I'll see you in a bit. I was happy.
Are there supposed to be blank pages?
No. No, well, yes, but yes, let's delete it.
Okay,
Um,
let me just go through it.
yeah, there were a couple, one more page then. There was one more page. I wanted to delete. So many pages, I think I might have to skip some. Okay, I'm getting towards the end. This is where I need to. Sorry.
Down.
Yeah, may not. I don't quite know what this word this is. Can I have a pen? Please? And then we can look. Thank you. Okay.
Oh,
Then we do all that. Do you think I should just do a webinar?
Hmm?
Should I just do a webinar?
instead of in person.
That doesn't make sense either, right?
People are still just rolling.
So should we start little late?
Mhm.
It's contradicting. This says.
This is really important. At this point, I wish I said just delete this slide.
No, I will skip it. I will just skip it. It is really important because if I get this question, I need that. I want the slide to. Are these connected? They are, right?
No.
They're not. Okay, so what comes after this? So I can talk about Karen.
This slide, yes.
Karen, would you hello? I just wanted to reach the. Is there a
Hi.
thank you slide?
No.
Maybe later you can add a thank you slide.
Okay, once we start, I won't be able to add it.
Okay.
Except that you can end this.
Okay, I'll end there.
There are more blank pages. This one can go.
Can we find a pen that works? Later. Not your fault, but. Thanks. Yeah, it seems like I'm a crazy red hand wielding teacher.
Can we just start?
Yes.
soon?
Yeah, we can start because most people are online and there are a lot of people online.
Yeah. So,
So are you going to click for me?
I can if you want, yeah.
I prefer to click myself, but
Oh, yeah,
sometimes
then
if
you
yeah.
just, yeah.
Is this it? Just put here.
Mhm.
Can I stand here the whole time? Can you see me? Are people on already? Can they hear me?
Yeah.
They can hear me. Are we live?
Actually, one.
Hello, morning, welcome John. Long time no see.
Happy almost.
I know, we're celebrating today. One of my sons gonna be a watermelon.
Oh,
Yes. Need Phil to let, we have a lot of people online today. We have 40 people online. There are a lot of people waiting to be let in. And just tell me when you want me to start. Okay, just so I know, like what age you're interested in.
Mine's 10 and 12.
10 and 12. Okay, so that's about the age when you start thinking about that.
Probably a bit too late too.
No.
For the 12 years old,
Well, depends where you want to go, but
Yeah.
for a boarding school, it's not late, nor is it late for international school.
Hello.
I assume they're in a local school. Yeah.
That's in 11. So I don't know whether you remember Nicole.
Yes, yeah.
She's in Cheltenham.
Oh,
Yes,
wow.
so I've got one daughter, she's already in the UK boarding, so my son like everybody. He's going to.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
going to. So I'm debating with my husband whether to keep it in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Or send him to UK as well
Okay.
as boarding.
Okay, so Hong
So-
Kong or UK?
Yeah.
Okay, just trying to, can people online hear me now, Phil? I'm very confused. Yes? Okay. Sorry for that weird type setup. I just wanted to get a sense of whether people are more interested in US or UK schools and their ages. So around middle school age and you?
Yes.
US, okay. And what age are you interested in? Grade 4. He's in grade 4. Okay. Hi, welcome. We are youngest member. All right, shall we begin? Welcome, everyone, to our webinar and live talk today. Very happy to have this hybrid event and to see some people live and also so many of you joining online. We're very happy to be resuming our parent seminars, and the topic today is school choices, a perennial topic, and one that is very much on my own mind right now because I'm doing a lot of college admissions counseling work and the deadline is in a few days. But what we're focused on today is not really the university level, but really more the middle school and high school years of international and boarding school. The title is a little bit, I guess, more a provocative title using the word versus, because of course it doesn't have to be either or. But let's get started. So I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Renée Boey. I know many of you here, but then online, I'm sure there's some people that are new to Baker and Bloom. So I'm the founder of Baker and Bloom, and I'm also a teacher. I've been a teacher for the past 16 years, and also founder of Bloom KKCA Academy, a primary school that we just launched this year in September in Hong Kong. And in relation to the topic today, I just want to highlight a couple of things in my background. I've worked in different types of contexts. I've taught in the US. In Hong Kong, I did my practicum in a local school, and I also taught at ISF Academy. And yeah, I think I'll just jump to my the more relevant aspects of my background, which is that I grew up in Hong Kong. I was born here, raised here, and I went to school in Marymount in Happy Valley, which is a local school. Actually, if you guys don't mind, can I take off my mask since we're at quite a distance? Okay, so then people online can also see my expressions. And then when I was in grade 7, after finishing grade 7, Form 1, I switched to HKIS, Hong Kong International School, which is a similar path that many people around my age took who were planning to go abroad. And so after grade 9 at HKIS, I switched again to a boarding school, and I applied to schools in the US. So the one I went to is called St. Paul's School. It's in Concord, New Hampshire, and it was a wonderful experience. I actually loved all my school experiences. So I guess I hope that is reflected in my sharing today, even though this is from way back when. I feel that all of these systems have their merits, and certainly depends a lot on the individual, what type of an experience they have. But personally, I enjoyed all of them. The local experience was very important to my foundation as a person, and my upbringing, and also my Chinese education, of course. And the years at HKS were also, I think, a great boost to my creativity, and also meeting people from all around the world and making friends from around the world. Our CEO, Jessica Yang, went to both Marymount and HKIS with me, and we also kind of had separate paths, but I think that the HKIS years were wonderful ones where I just got to interact with, in a way, people even more diverse in some ways than in boarding school. And then in boarding school, different type of diversity, people from many different countries, but also many different parts of the US. But I say that a little more international in that the boarding school context is more Northeastern in culture, and with a strong sense of heritage and tradition. So the population was very diverse, but the tradition itself was more dominant in terms of being one culture, whereas international schools have a more multicultural atmosphere. And as I mentioned, I did my practicum in a local school. I did it at St. Paul's Co-ed, which is also where a lot of Baker and Bloom students are from. And it's a wonderful school with a very strong reputation. What's interesting about SPCC is that it's really evolved, I think, over the years. And even at the secondary level, it offers the IB now. And I think it's a school that is a great example of how local schools adapt and evolve themselves. And then I taught at ISF Academy, which when I taught there, it was the first 3 years of its establishment, at least on the new campus in Sabroport. And it was also a wonderful experience that showed me something that's different from international and local schools. So that might be something some of you are considering as well. So I bring this up to say that I also have both a student perspective and a teacher's perspective on some of these types of schools. And in terms of Baker and Bloom, we are a K through 12 education center that I founded 7 years ago. And our mission really is not related to admissions per se, but to cultivate creativity and love of learning and to really prepare kids for the future. Of course, a lot of students come with their own goals, and parents have have different needs. And so just want to show you that we have a very broad spectrum of students from both local schools, international and ESF schools, and our teachers are really used to teaching kids from different systems. And that's one of the advantages and the joys of being an education center teacher, because you get to work in a very personal way, really dive very deeply into the work of students from different backgrounds, and you get this range in terms of the types of assignments, of the types of learning and assessments that our kids are working on. And of course, we have boarding school admissions counseling, as well as university admissions counseling. I will say that we have a stronger focus on the university level in the US than the UK, but we have been successful with our UK applicants as well. And that's because there's less to do for UK admissions. And we do counseling in terms of school choices, but by and large, our students know where they want to go. So it's really just working on the UCAS statement. And then, of course, some of them work on the interviews and subject-specific tests. But the US, there's a lot more decisions, a lot more work involved in the years leading up to college admissions as well. One of the things leading up is the choice of secondary schools. And so we also get a lot of questions about that. And so the way I want to think about today is I often run into parents outside of work as well, and they'll ask me, oh, my kid is like grade 4 in a local school. We're beginning to think about different options. What do you think of international schools? And then they start asking questions about boarding schools as well. And so I want to kind of treat it as like a conversation that way, except that I will substantiate my advice and my sharing with a lot more evidence. So you can see some present trends as well, and some numbers. Okay, so the overview of the sharing is first to make a general comparison, highlighting some things that you may know but not have recalled, and to draw attention to a couple of them. And then important factors to consider when you're choosing between the two, if it is between, or if you're just deciding whether you want to switch from local schools. And then I want to focus on curricular differences, because this is something that may not be as apparent when you look at websites. And then to consider when, because the timing is often an important factor. And then to talk about how this relates to college admissions, because these are the topics that I find most parents are interested in. So in terms of comparing the two, this is basic data drawn from the EDB website that shows you these are numbers in international schools, or sorry, of international schools in Hong Kong in 2020 to 2021, past year. So you can see primary schools, and when they say primary, that means primary only. For example, like Peak School, where there's no secondary. And then secondary schools where there's only secondary. And then the through trained schools and schools with special needs or special focus, like special area of focus. And then the total number of students. So you can see that excluding special needs schools, there's about 41,000 students in Hong Kong that attend international schools. And then do take a look. Oh, I have cut off that. Oopsie. Oh, okay. I cut off the percentage, unfortunately, but I can just say that there's been a drop in non-local students this year, just comparing 2020 to 2019, and then an increase in the number of local students, which perhaps is no surprise if you are living in Hong Kong. You understand the changes that have been taking place in terms of our expat community, and also because of COVID. And also because of 2019, there are more people who switched and wanted to enter international non-local schools. And then I just want to highlight this special category of schools called private independent schools. And these are schools that sometimes have the word international in their name, so they seem to be clumped together, but they are technically different. And by law, they're required to have 40% of Hong Kong permanent residents in their student population. So these are the 7. And as someone who just launched a school, unfortunately, it seems like the government doesn't intend to grant a lot more of these licenses. So the well-known ones are ISF, International Christian School, and Choi Gai Yao. Actually, they're all very well known. But so just to let you know, these are not technically international schools, even though some of them offer IB, which is a bit confusing because in most countries around the world, if you offer IB, you might be an international school, but not the case in Hong Kong. Okay, moving on. Okay, and then international schools. So the one of the key features of international schools is, and it goes back to the history of the schools, which is to serve the people from a certain country that are living in Hong Kong. So French International School was set up to serve the French community, likewise German Swiss, HIS to serve the American community. CIS is a bit of an exception because it really has this emphasis on Chinese that was quite pioneering when it started and continues to be quite pioneering. And as a result, you have schools that offer multiple curriculum options. Very often it is international baccalaureate at the diploma program level, which are the final 2 years. And then depending on their national curriculum. So it might be the Canadian Ontario curriculum, it might be the French baccalaureate or the UK path. That's kind of less common now. The ESF schools have just basically embraced IB. Kellett still does A-levels. And so when it comes to the senior curriculum choice, there might be different streams. And you do have a lot of options in the primary level as well, because there are schools that do international primary curricula, the IPC. Please mute. Sorry, could you just take a look? I think someone just joined. If you don't mind muting, that'd be helpful. Thank you. So in the early years, if you're considering that, because some of our parents in the audience I see with many people. So some of them may be considering moving from kindergarten to a international versus, well, I guess not boarding, but international versus local school. So I do want to note that even at the primary years, there are schools that are IB, PYP, not that many in and that can all lead towards IB. And then in terms of the admissions procedure, some things that are quite unique include debentures and capital levies in Hong Kong, which as parents, I'm sure you've read about, and is something that, you know, is different. You kind of have to read the fine print in terms of the actual fees and costs of going to an international school. There are some, I wouldn't say they're hidden, they're pretty transparent, but like debentures are not required, right? But they do give priority to students who do have debentures. And it is very competitive to attend the top international schools. I think in the past, it wasn't as competitive, but now across the board, it's become more competitive. So in the past, it used to be like, say, year 7, when people leave primary school, it was competitive. But if you entered grade 4, it wasn't that competitive. But these days, it's like kind of moving down because people realize that, and you know, they start applying earlier. And then also there are people who used to go to boarding schools who've decided not to go, which is why this talk, I think, is particularly resonant this year. And so they're looking at options in Hong Kong. And so just a reminder that it's something to think. If you are planning, it doesn't hurt to start going to open days, doing tours, and doing a little bit of just sounding out, talking to students a year or 2 in advance, so that you have a better picture. And by the time you're applying, the year before you want your child to enter, you're actually focused on the application and not still making like broad stroke decisions. And then the other thing is wait lists and wait pools. So some schools have wait lists where it's sequenced and it's sort of by order, first come, first serve, if you put on the wait list, that is. And then some schools like HKIS has wait pools where you put into sort of like a holding room. And then when they have a spot, the school reserves the right to choose the best fit child who may not be the most recent, the first one to have applied. And I mentioned before that these different schools in terms of primary, secondary, and through train. So definitely take a look if you want to be in a through train school to make sure that there is a secondary if you're entering in the primary years, and also whether the secondary has the curriculum options that you actually want for your child, thinking long term. It's one of the reasons why IB has grown so popular in Hong Kong, because of optionality, right? So you can go to the UK, you can stay in Hong Kong, you can go to the US, it's recognized around the world. But to be honest, A-levels and advanced placement are equally globally recognized. So I do want to sort of disabuse you of that notion that the IB is the only way to get into schools from around the world. Actually, even the DSE can get you into top schools, both in the US and the UK. IB, of course, has its reputation for being academically very rigorous. Right, okay, I have a slide that follows about the curriculum. But before I get into that, one thing that is quite unique and different between boarding schools and international schools is, of course, the Chinese education. We're in Hong Kong, it is a Chinese-speaking environment, and there's a lot more Chinese everywhere. And so if that is something that you want to see through the end of secondary school, that of course would put you in favor of staying. And within Hong Kong international schools, there are different ones. Ones where Chinese is very much a second language, additional language option, and ones that embrace it as an equal academic language. So that's something to definitely ask about and to look into. And then also how many years of experience they have doing that as well. Dual language schools are technically different from bilingual schools. I won't dive into the differences right now, but just think about also the differences between having 2 teachers in one room covering every topic, which is a little bit like, say, IMS does it, International Montessori School, versus schools where they are taught separately. So you have equal number of hours in, say, French and English in the French program design at FIS. I'm using that as a example of how dual language design might be different. Obviously with French, they use French and English and not Chinese and English, but there's similar approaches with Chinese as well. And so that, I think, affects your child's experience. If you're learning math twice in 2 languages, what does that mean? Or if it's Chinese first, and then you switch to English after a certain number of years, how does that affect your child? So every child, even within the same family, I think has very different linguistic profile and different preferences. So I think it's important to think about your own child's strengths and the mode in which they learn best linguistically. Another unique and exciting feature of international schools are the overseas trips and the excursions and the emphasis on experiential learning. So boarding schools by and large are amazing. I'll show you many pictures about to show you how beautiful their campuses are. The physical campus is a huge reason to go to a boarding school. And part of the reason is that they're usually in rather secluded, remote places, with the idea of helping kids, focus. And I'm sure it's easier to get land when it's remote and not at the heart of London or in the middle of New York City. And so as a result, it's more a self-contained ecosystem. And when you go there, students participate in activities there. And of course, there are amazing opportunities to go abroad as well, to spend a whole semester abroad. But with international schools, especially speaking specifically about Hong Kong, our students have access to countries around Asia and annual trips. Trips like, to volunteer in Cambodia or to go to New Zealand. And so I think pre-COVID, of course, it really offers a wealth of international experience that very few boarding schools can compete with. Often, of course, if you're in the UK, there are trips to Europe, to different parts of Europe, but they're not like school-wide usually. So that's something that I think is a wonderful feature of international schools. And then there are lots of opportunities tied with that for service. And I think a lot of the schools in Hong Kong are IB, and with CAS, the requirement for creativity, action, and service is actually a requirement. And so compared to boarding schools that often also encourage that, of course, with IB schools, it's an actual requirement and built into the program. So you don't have to worry about that as much to make sure that your child has that exposure and that experience, which I think is very important as part of a holistic education of doing service. The fun part is a lot of them do things abroad. With athletics, this used to be a kind of more simple comparison because there were just basically more options abroad. But I feel like in the past decade, it's really changed. People who stay in Hong Kong can take sports equally seriously, train very seriously, and compete in the most competitive level, right? And so, as we know from this summer, we also have Olympic level sports training in Hong Kong. And with sports specifically like fencing, you may do better to stay here where there is a more rigorous, robust circuit, and it may not even be offered in some boarding schools. Another type of sport that falls under this category would be sailing, right? Not many schools offer sailing. And then, of course, if you're doing things like wushu and things like that, you may not even have any options in boarding schools. And then in terms of university destination, this is another big distinction. International schools have people from all over the world, from the Middle East, from Europe, from Australia. And so they're ready to send kids all over. And so when they do college counseling, they are explicitly addressing that range and diversity. Whereas in boarding schools, it would be quite exotic to go somewhere else. And in the UK, for example, the average is about 5% of students graduating from UK schools will actually go elsewhere, including the US. Okay, so just some pictures. You can see, like, we now have in the past decade a lot more British schools that have opened in Hong Kong that bring a lot of that boarding school life tradition to Hong Kong. Some of it is transformed into a day school experience, but there are schools like Harrow, of course, where you can actually board and has gorgeous campus. Many of the international schools have like world-class campuses, especially with regard to athletic grounds. So that part is also quite exciting. And as you can see, a lot of the outdoors experience. Hong Kong has beautiful nature. And I just included this slide to highlight how international schools have been adapting. So Canadian recently has shifted a focus to Chinese language, and you can see that from their website. And I think this is a way in which the international schools are responding to the fact that many of their students, the graduates may actually be thinking long-term staying in Asia, whereas in the past, really people just went all over. And then these are, I won't get into detail, but you should look into the differences between the middle year program, which is the orange one, that has a very holistic approach covering many different subjects with some transdisciplinary themes in the NYP. I taught NYP. It's a very interesting framework because it is, I think, very progressive. At the same time, there's very little content. So it's an assessment framework. And so that means it depends a lot on whether the school has an experienced teacher designing the curriculum and running and teaching the program. So the design is great, but the execution is kind of where the rubber meets the road and what matters to your child. So do test that out by asking alumni, by asking about, by visiting their schools if they have open days and looking at student work. I think asking around about the quality of teaching is a big factor. And with the diploma program, Hong Kong boasts really high results. Although I have to say, Hong Kong's approach to the IB is not sometimes entirely the way maybe IB originally was designed to be, which is very much about a global, intercultural, holistic education. But in Hong Kong, it's often the final 2 years, sort of like an alternative to the A levels traditionally. And Hong Kong students do very well because we're very good at taking tests. But the IB is about way more than the exams. So I want to emphasize that because as a former IB educator and someone with respect for the IB program, I think that it offers more than the exam results or the tests. At the same time, I think that there are downsides to the IB. So in the school that I'm designing, we do not use the IB intentionally. And that's because of the curricular options that I think that the A levels and the AP offer and the opportunity to gain depth. Because IB is about being well-rounded with the 6 subjects, 3 higher level subjects, 3 standard level. Higher level is 240 hours of coursework. A levels is actually about 340 hours, 340 or 360. But anyways, it's in the higher 300 range. And you only do 3 subjects. So you can do 4, but you're not required to. But if you do the IB, you have to do standard level, which is 150 hours across 2 years. So that's a lot of work in subjects that your child may not love or be great at. So from an educational point of view, it is more well-rounded. From an admissions point of view, you might want to think about what you want. So we can talk more about that later. Okay, I have to move faster. Boarding schools. So maybe I'll stop talking, give you a chance to read the slide first. Many people who have attended boarding schools, parents that I speak to, feel that the academic experience in boarding schools is more rigorous than international schools. This, I don't think, is necessarily true. The IB is a very rigorous program. At the same time, it is true that the teacher-student ratio in many boarding schools is ridiculously low. Some of it is like 1 to 3. And a lot of that is because boarding schools have endowments. Very few international schools do. There's a lot of economics behind schools that explain why they are the way they are. And there's also a very strong tradition of people whose parents taught in boarding schools. They basically grew up in boarding schools. And then after a sojourn into a few other things, they return. And so people who normally in Hong Kong would be teaching in a university would choose to teach at a boarding school. So there's a very high percentage of faculty who are highly educated with advanced degrees, and you have constant 24/7 access to these teachers. And it is different, I think, as someone who went to boarding school. Your relationship with your teacher is obviously going to be more personal and more in a way more intense because they know more facets of you and you're living in the same community, right? And it's usually a very close-knit, small community under 1,000 students. And their families are there, their children are growing up there often, so they are very invested. Whereas international schools are quite notorious for high turnover rates, for people who are coming because they love living in a place like Hong Kong, at least in the past. Obviously this year, and maybe next year as well, COVID has affected things a lot, which is something to think about if your child is thinking about switching right now, because it's hard for international schools to hire right now because of COVID. And whereas in boarding schools, they're teaching, the faculty hasn't changed much, right? So there is a little bit more continuity, I would say, in that sense. Also, incredible extracurricular offerings, and very often it means no tutoring. And I do want to emphasize here that there are people, especially because of the culture of Asia in general, tutoring is seen as, your regular, very common practice. But in boarding schools, it is very much frowned upon and often leads to behavioral consequences. So that is something to remember. It is a wonderful thing in the sense that people have more time to do things like sports, music, arts, and to meet with their friends and to do a lot of learning together after school, as opposed to the lifestyle of Hong Kong where tutoring is also kind of just par for the course. Challenging academics with diverse offerings. I'll get into that in the curriculum. So this is the overview. And very experienced college counseling teams, because they're often called prep schools for a reason. People send their kids there with the expectation that they're going to prepare them very well for university, including the counseling process. And a more diverse range of friends. I did mention that sometimes there's more of a global atmosphere in international schools, but I do want to say that in many ways, the boarding experience is more intense in terms of meeting people from different backgrounds, because you're rooming with them, you're listening to their conversations with their families, you're eating with them every single day, and you do get to know more about people's backgrounds in the countries than maybe if you were a Chinese person in an international school in Hong Kong, where you're kind of the majority. And then the tradition, the community, and the global network that boarding schools offer is, of course, very appealing. Just some things to highlight, reasons why people often choose UK versus US schools. UK boarding schools are known for their high quality pastoral care. They're often house masters, house mistresses that have, again, like I was saying, like generations of this culture of going to boarding schools. The United Kingdom has a very strong tradition of that. Some people even send their kids when they're only 8 or 10. And so you can imagine the duty of care and the quality of care when you're sending kids that young is very high. And they really do see themselves as a big family. So everything from like what they eat, when they wake up, to whether they're healthy. I think the UK boarding schools do a wonderful job there. And then, of course, these schools some of them are 1,000, like hundreds of years old, Seven Oaks is very old, Eton is, of course, very old, and it brings with it this certain aura and this sense of pride in being part of a heritage of academic and career excellence, which is important. I do think young people, it's not so much that the prestige, okay, but more the fact that for young people, I think, to think back and to see that people graduating from their school had a certain achievement inspires them and gives them role models to push themselves and to rise. And of course, it also means a lot of alumni come back to talk. That might be quite inspiring as well. And lots of fun traditions as well. And then sports. I think UK and US offer a lot of sports that are the same, but also different as well. So, things like cricket, rugby, and lacrosse. And so I think looking at the campus and what offerings there are is one reason people make different choices. With the US, I do think there's more of an emphasis on STEM and innovation than the UK, because that's kind of a broad difference between the two countries overall. And so the facilities, you can really see that in the facilities. With performing arts as well, I think that UK, very high caliber of instruction as well. But I think in the US, they really have a lot of people, alumni, who throw money at the school to really build excellent galleries, theaters. I went to school with a dance company that professional dance companies recruited from. So, ballet was huge. I have students from Choate who performed in Carnegie Hall. Actually, I have students also from the UK who performed in Carnegie Hall. So that's not unique to the US, but I do think there's just a strong tradition of that. And many students in boarding schools might actually get instruction from, like, say, Juilliard, even when they're in high school. So that is really quite impressive. And I would say that in some ways that I'm talking about the most selective top boarding schools, they have a very strong, like, pre-professional type of training, especially if you're talking about the performing arts and sports, which in Hong Kong is not as common. Hong Kong is still, even the international schools, more academically focused, and it's more a cultural thing. I don't think that I'm not saying that the school's intended to be that way, but I think that overall there's more a range of talent that is actively cultivated. Not that the talent doesn't lie in the international schools, but I think it's about whether the schools themselves celebrate that type of achievement. So I do feel that boarding schools have kind of a broader definition of success in some ways. So going back to my point about the IB, and in Hong Kong kind of looking at, whether this is a good IB school, let's look at the average scores. And that's kind of how people evaluate, like, how many 45s did they get? There's a lot more to a school than the number that is produced by the top students. So I do want to encourage you to think about that and what speaks to your families in terms of what you want for your child. So some statistics, I will also let you read a bit. Number of boarding schools in the US, just to give you a sense, actually 300. Of course, when people come for admissions counseling, it feels like there's only like 3, but there's actually a huge range. So I want to say that because if actually what you want are some of these experiences of diversity, of celebration of the arts, of cultivating their sports and nature and facilities, there are many schools beyond the 20 that you often hear about. And do look more broadly. You can see the acceptance rates, the average SAT scores, and then with schools that are more competitive, around 20 of them, you can see that the average SAT score that in terms of graduates is about 1,400. The average incoming SSAT score is about 87%. People ask me that a lot, like, what does my SSAT score need to be? It doesn't need to be anything. These are averages. So obviously some people are below the average, but it gives you a gauge, right, of the standards. All right, so the acceptance rate is also around, well, you can see the breakdown there. Okay. So some factors to consider. Personal factors first, because I really think that as a parent myself, each child is different, and thinking about what might make your child thrive is really important. So how does your child learn best? Collaboratively, when there's a lot of pressure. Some people do perform when there is a school with more pressure because they need that challenge, right, to inspire them and to also make them feel like, other people are equally working equally hard. I need to up my game. So I'm not saying it's always the case that like more pressure is bad. But there is also a rising, I would say, a very upsetting trend in terms of mental health factors. And when you go to boarding school, you're going to a very new environment, and in the COVID era, that is obviously even more daunting because travel is more difficult. And as parents, of course, we worry about their health. And so you do have to think about whether your child is mature enough to handle some of the challenges, or whether they will kind of lose their way. And that's also why when you choose boarding schools, to talk about the advising system, the pastoral care is equally important. Because while at first you might look at all the academics and matriculation results, when your child's actually there, you will care about if they get pneumonia, like my brother did the first term he was in boarding school. How are they going to treat him? Are they going to support him? Are they going to just throw him in the infirmary? So he was at boarding school. His advisor actually took the whole class to the infirmary. Although now that we're so much more educated about germs, I kind of think, like they took the whole class to his room where he had pneumonia and like ran the class there. And of course, though, that made him feel very looked after. And so do think about the level of care, the desire for independence. When people come for like the first meeting, we often ask, the child themselves, do you want to go? And actually, many children will say no, or they're not sure, which is understandable. They may never visited the country, and they may be very happy where they're at. So it's harder for them to project and think like 6 years later, I may actually want to be in a certain country more than another country. So you do, I think, have to balance between giving them information that might help them make the decision and not pushing too hard so that they feel that if they don't go, they are disappointing you. Because then it actually does show in their application. And then most of all, when they're actually there, whether they're happy and whether they will succeed. Things that actually influence boarding schools may be things that you never planned, like the roommate. You know, if they have a roommate that upsets them a lot, it will add a lot of stress to their academics, to their whole life. Right. And of course, if they meet a roommate that makes them open up, that makes them want to learn more and, be more driven, that you can also not account for. So there's a bit of that unknown. But I think what you do know is your own child, and having conversations with your child, sharing with them, introducing them to people who've been to boarding schools, different types of boarding schools is, I think, very helpful. So people used to send their kids to summer schools. These days, very difficult, but perhaps when that is possible again, you can consider it. But I think also schools abroad are bringing summer programs to Hong Kong more and more. And I suspect next summer you see more of that as well. And the family context, meaning many people have roots and family in different parts of the world. Okay, I have to move faster. Academic focus. So which curriculum suits your child and any particular interests or strengths? So this goes back to what I've actually been talking about already. If you have a child who is already doing coding, been coding since they were 4 and kind of exhausted resources in their schools, you might want to consider boarding schools because they do have incredible facilities, especially in the US, I have to say. This is from my own school, St. Paul's, where they actually have a globe that I think no other high school has, where you can see live feeds of the weather. It's like a satellite view. It's kind of sci-fi. And there are robotics competitions. A lot of boarding schools have research programs where you work with actual, either your teacher who's conducting graduate level research, or there's like Lawrenceville has a great program where you actually get to do university level research. So that's very exciting in terms of science, technology, engineering, and math. Art and performance, I've kind of already covered this. You see the choke, there's the Paul Mellon Arts Center, and that's not just there. Many boarding schools have these facilities, and they have director of art programs that are very high caliber. So they're not teachers who can teach the IB art and also direct a film or direct choreograph dancing. Their whole job at the school is to run the arts program. And then extracurricular activities, hundreds of options usually. Because the kids are living there, schools often feel compelled to offer more. So you could
just competing with other antlions for this biotic factor. They may have to compete with completely different species in the area that are also predators of ants too. For example, jumping spiders like ants.
Oh, okay. Now
it's not just consumers that compete, completely different species in the area that are also
the joys of COVID times. Okay, so with extracurricular options, the UK, for example, for younger kids, they offer a lot of athletics, social, cultural events over the weekends as well, so that the kids don't get into trouble over the weekends and have a lot of options. I will highlight certain things I think that are particularly strong in boarding schools compared to international schools. I think the level of competition overall for writing, speech, debate, Model UN, actually maybe not Model UN, but for debate and for writing, there are usually more publications, and the level of the publications is extremely high. It's almost college level and often student run. So if those are some areas that are strengths for your child, definitely look into that, not just the curriculum, but also the caliber of the extracurricular offerings. And the opportunities to travel and compete there may be more these days abroad. English curriculum and college readiness. I think the subject that is the most difficult for most Hong Kong students moving abroad is English. And I'm not saying this because I'm an English teacher, but I do think that with math and science, Hong Kong kids are quite well prepared. They're often the ones taking the honors level classes. But when it comes to English, it's a good idea to be prepared earlier on. So you can see that with the IB curriculum, there are more global texts. It's very structured because that's what the IB is. It's something that across nations stays the same. There are fewer electives because they're already asking you to do 6 subjects, and they want that kind of uniformity across countries. And there are more projects, oral examinations where you have to, it's actually part of the requirement to graduate, you have to present the IOCs, like where you have to do oral commentaries. Even in sports at IB, you have to do a lot of writing and presentations. Not the case with boarding schools. Sports is just still kind of pretty much sports, and there's not a lot of like analysis involved. If you dance, you join the, you dance, and you don't exactly have to write about dancing, which the IB does. So, but that though, I have to say, can be excellent for certain types of students, because it's kind of like meta thinking, the history of the art form, or the ability to communicate, which the international schools really emphasize, or at least the International Baccalaureate program really emphasizes. And then with the foreign language options, you can have more bilingual options that are very strong. Boarding schools usually have good foreign language programs, but you may not have as many students taking it. With boarding schools, it's a bit more esoteric because most of them are independent schools. They're called independent schools for a reason, which means they kind of have control over the curriculum. And very often the faculty kind of offer what they want to offer. And there's less consistency across the board. Even if you're all in grade 10, your teachers may be doing different things. And very often they'll hire someone from like an Ivy League school, maybe it's their 3rd year of teaching, and that person loves women's studies, and then you look at your child's syllabus and it's like every author is female. Nothing wrong with that, I think that's fantastic, but I'm just telling you that it is quite idiosyncratic, and there's kind of less of a consistent standard, even year to year in boarding schools. Whereas international schools very much standards-based curriculum. And at the same time, that can mean that it is the curriculum is really very much alive in boarding schools. The teachers are teaching what they're very passionate about. So they bring a lot of their own personal interests into the classroom. And a lot of students find that super exciting and inspiring. So like say in Winchester, there's a class called Div, and people discuss whatever the master wants to discuss. And it might be current events, might be religion, it might be controversial topics, and they learn to talk about it, debate. And I do think it cultivates a level of eloquence and communication skills that is quite impressive. More verbal responses. So different from presentations, international schools do a lot of presentations, whereas boarding schools do a lot of discussions. They're more casual. And there's a classical emphasis in boarding schools. In Hong Kong, you can't even take the A-levels Latin. So there's definitely more of a tradition there. Often it's a requirement in UK boarding schools to do Latin and sometimes French. And there's also, depending on the country, you will read more British texts if you're going to England, more American texts if you're going to the US. Okay, so sample course comparisons to illustrate that. So if you're in grade 11, you might do junior English if it's an American school, or A-levels, IB, and then you'll do the senior year exam-oriented option. In boarding schools, you might do Gothic literature, living in the tomb, media studies, Florence and the Medici, which is a course I took. And then we got to go to Florence. Discrete mathematics, the techniques of composition and analysis, computer science, algorithm, and public policy. So you can see how there is more, it's more similar to like a college. And also you can use your curricular choices to indicate to colleges in applications what your specific interests are in boarding schools. But there are electives, I do want to point out, in HKIS and some schools. Not many schools have electives. Sample texts, which also illustrate that. These are the very, I mean, I teach IB English. These are texts that you can teach year after year after year. Many teachers choose these texts. Of course, there are some exceptions. They have choice as well in the IB. It's a very wonderful long list, but these are the usual suspects. And then in boarding schools, you can see it's more of a classical approach and very Western oriented rather than a global centric curriculum. And comparing the academics, I'm not giving you the statistics per se, but I want to say that these are the things that I would compare if I were comparing any two schools, and certainly boarding versus international. So the educational background of the faculty, the ratio, the size of the classes, whether they're offering at the advanced level the courses your children might want. Look through the course catalog, look at the percentile of the SSAT incoming students as an indication of kind of the level of competition, which is something to consider because some kids could get into a good boarding school, but may not academically then rank the top 15%. So think about the consequences of that for college admissions versus being top of your class at a school somewhere else. And you can read faculty profiles as well. All right, so we're nearing the end of the sharing and then I'll take questions. So timing. These are some things to think about. If your child is really thriving, I do say think carefully about when to uproot them because you may want to let them, even though it's more competitive, you may want to let them finish their primary school years before you switch because they feel like they can graduate with their friends and there's some level of closure to the whole primary experience. And I understand why parents also value that. At the same time, if they're not academically very strong, and it is a lot easier to apply 1 year earlier, that may be something you also have to weigh in. And then with English proficiency, all the top international schools have some form of reading comprehension test. Some use standardized tests like CAP4 or MAP test, ISEE, depending on US versus UK. Schools like German Swiss often have like a filter test that is standardized and then a more school-based test that is more intense. Usually it's just English and math. And they are accepting more kids who have ESL background. As you saw early on, the non-local students numbers, the local school student intake is rising. So their standards is obviously also changing. But if you want to be competitive, obviously, if you're strong reader writer, strong vocabulary, that helps a lot. And being able to perform well in the conversation, the interview, that is also very common in most schools. And Chinese proficiency as well, if it is a bilingual school, that is a huge advantage. And then what is happening in the local system, TSA, the territory-wide assessment, happens in grade 3, grade 5, and secondary 3. So often, people want to skip that. And you just go online, but it is very confusing how every school labels their grades. So in every conversation with parents, we have to confirm like date of birth, like what are we talking about here? Because like year 7 could mean grade 6 in the American system, could mean primary 6 in the Hong Kong system. They call them reception year, K3, foundation year, year 1, all of that is like the same thing. So do be careful when you look at the website and don't do things like miss the whole deadline because you thought you were supposed to apply the year after. Oh, sorry, do I have that? It's the fall, okay, I can't go back, but it's the fall of K2 that you might want to apply if you're switching into an international school to get into their foundation year. So some questions to consider. There's in American schools, and there are more American system international schools now in Hong Kong than before. Grade 6 to 8 are the middle school years. And quite interestingly, it happens to be the beginning of the middle years of MYP as well. But that goes from grade 6 to grade 10. And if it's GCSE, then you want to definitely enter before grade 9, which is form 3, because that's the first year of the 2-year IGCSE program. So you have to choose subjects. And they don't really allow you to enter after that. Same for boarding school, actually. And for A levels, the intake, you take the 16+ exam if you're going to boarding school, and it would be the 6th form entry, the final 2 years. If you're thinking very young, often people have to begin prepping around grade 4 because you're taking the exam grade 5 to enter the year after grade 5. So it feels incredibly early, but actually you need to prepare. Oh, Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Okay. And then you can also think about whether you're planning, oops, okay, that was good. I was gonna say, you might want to think about whether you're going to boarding school after, and if you are, you can look at the results from previous years, right? Some schools send more kids to UK boarding schools, some kids send more kids to US boarding schools. Some don't send any to boarding schools, so you might want to think about that, or very few. That does not mean it's a bad thing. Because if you go to a school that sends tons of kids to boarding schools, every year you are competing also with tons of kids. And of course, there are parents with legacy and this and that. And also, it's just a weighing of how competitive you think your child is in terms of admissions. And okay, moving on to college. I will be quick here and then take questions because I feel like that might be might help you more. So what do colleges look for? They look for many things, and I'm talking about highly selective colleges, but the first and foremost thing to worry about is the transcript, because you hear more about like what type of sports people are doing. They want to be a squash recruit, or they started this charity, all of those kind of not bells and whistles, but very kind of high profile feats and accomplishments. But the core of your application is really your high school academic performance, your grades. And your these days, standardized testing, because of COVID, has become more of an option. So it is easier to choose schools that are test optional. But if you have high standardized scores, that obviously makes you more competitive as well. And then they also look at ways in which you can demonstrate intellectual rigor and vitality by the extracurricular pursuits. So there are people who've done research projects, people who choose summer programs that are competitive to enter. But of course, this is quite well known, the US admissions method is very holistic. And that means they look at a lot of personal qualities, leadership, service, and how do you demonstrate that? So obviously you have to do things outside of school. And that is a big difference between US and UK boarding schools. I do think by and large, UK boarding schools are more academically focused, and they see extracurricular in a very, I think, wholesome way as a way to balance out your academics. And so it's not that they don't have it, and lots of options. But I think that you will find that in boarding school in the US, there's more intense pressure to compete at the varsity level and to even with things like debate, be very competitive because they are fully aware of how this affects their college admissions. Whereas by and large, still with the UK, you can get into great schools riding on your grades. And then athletics, arts, these are the different ways you can stand out. And then at the very end, we wrote the X factor. And that has to do with sometimes your rapport with the admissions officers that meet you, or something about your application essay, your personal statement that shows them that you are someone with imagination, someone with a lot of empathy, or someone who's been through a lot of adversity and overcome them. And so even if your grades are not the best, they feel that you will be adding something quite rare and valuable to their community, because the admissions officers are building a class. So they're not looking for 1,000 of the same, but really a mosaic that is going to look beautiful at the end. And of course, they have to serve different departments. So you may have a very strong engineering program, but you still have to fill up folklore and mythology, perhaps, or maybe not folklore and mythology, although I love that major. It might be like your comp lit class can't have like 0 students. So there is a balance, of course, and it affects what people put on their applications. Again, some stats, just to go through it very quickly. CIS. You can see most of the kids go 30% US, 15% UK. And that gives you a sense of how international schools are different from boarding schools as well, right? Because they usually go to their own country. HKIS, usually US. 80% go off to the US. This just to take an example of Groton, one of the very best boarding schools, most recent matriculation data. You can take a look, right? So Chicago 27, and you can see how that compares with international schools. So most international schools in Hong Kong, even over the course of 5 years, are not sending 15 students to Yale or 27 to Chicago, right? Or 21 to Harvard. So there is a difference, and it makes sense. these US schools are also not sending tons of kids to Oxford, right? So it's a cultural thing, and they are prep schools designed to get kids into these colleges. But you also see that there's also a huge diversity of schools as well. So I do think that with boarding schools, they explain the differences very well. And because it's the home turf, there are representatives from different schools that come to the schools themselves. People ask me that all the time. So this is my thoughts on that. Basically, you can never know. Even if one path worked well for your son, it may not work for your daughter. And so, some people think, okay, I want the pastoral care of the UK, and then I'm going to go there and then switch to the US, and that's going to be better. And that may be, but we can't tell. But what you can consider are these things that I've already been talking about, so I won't repeat them, but they're on the slide. And I think that these days, I guess what is maybe less obvious is to think about the social emotional readiness of your child. Because you really don't want to waste a year where your child is so unhappy in boarding school and they can't, it's not even just academics. It's like, it's 1 year of their life, a very formative year of their life. So if they don't want to go, and if they're not prepared to go, you might want to wait, right? They can enter sixth form if they want that boarding school experience. And even US, you can join grade 11. So sometimes if they're not ready because there's something they're going through in life, it may not be wise to push them too hard to go, even if you feel it might be more advantageous. Right, so I mentioned this before, it's more of a summary of some of the factors, right? Any sports or special interests. So like, for example, they're very good at writing, you may consider boarding schools because of the more resources there. So these are the 3 areas: the academics, the extracurricular, and the personal. And I will take questions. But I have a lot of random statistics that I've prepared. I will wait for questions. And I guess this is something people have asked me about. Phil, if you don't mind coming in, it would be helpful. How do I go back? Every time I click, I go forward. Oh, okay. Here's the keyboard. Got it. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to take questions now. Are there any questions in the chat room?
Yeah. So one of the questions from the chat group is, hi Renée, thank you for your time. Is year 9 too late for entry in a boarding?
I guess when you say too late, do you mean too late in terms of making it helping them, giving them enough time to adjust in order to prepare for college and to do well during their years there? I'm going to assume that's what you mean, because it's obviously not too late to apply. You can even apply, for sixth form. I don't think so, because actually, if you look at university admissions, it often really is the exit qualification academically that matter, and those are usually the final 2 years. And year 9, you're actually still quite young. Year 9 is grade 8. You haven't even entered high school yet. Most of boarding school in the US begins year 10. So year 10 meaning grade 9. Grade 9.
More competitive.
Oh, I see. It is more competitive, as in there are, yes. So this is generally true. There are years where there are larger intakes. So a lot does depend on how well your child performs on standardized tests. But I think this is something you should weigh against the personal factors, because if they're able to continue to pursue, let's say, their Chinese and one sport, even for their college admissions, that might make a difference. Because you don't know, even if they go to the UK, they might want to do Oriental studies or like Chinese history, and that year might make a difference. So again, it has to do with the readiness, both academically and personally. But from sheer statistics, yes, it is more challenging to apply out of sync with most schools, or a little bit later and further down the line. Same for boarding schools. Like boarding schools often take about 100 kids freshman year, and then like maybe, let's say 150 kids freshman year and 80 kids or 60 kids sophomore year. So just sheer numbers. And also the people who choose to go later might also be academically more competitive. So that does affect the numbers. Yeah. Any other questions from the room? There's a lot of information, I know. What are some things that, like, before this talk you kind of were wondering about, as opposed to all the information per se. I know it's hard to weigh a lot of different things.
How could we know that a child has the potential to be a top 15
Yeah.
in the boarding school
Yes.
before we make that decision?
That's a very good question. Of course, what any parent would want is that once you get to boarding school, you are transformed. And even if you were not capable of that, you would become through the high caliber teaching. I think that can happen. I have personally seen students who were like, say, B+ students in international school soar in boarding schools. And a lot of that, especially I would say, if you feel your child is bored but brilliant, that's a good reason to go to boarding school. Because there are kids who don't seem to be getting great grades in international schools. I actually find that all the time, especially ones that have been in international schools from reception year and are very comfortable with the system and sort of like have friends, are doing well. They don't really need to push themselves. And how you see that? Okay, if they go to a summer program, you can do an online program and they find it intellectually very stimulating. They talk about it with you over dinner. They suddenly start talking about current events or whatever it is, like they're taking, let's say, psychology. They took a class there and they sound so much more enthusiastic. Those are good signs that intellectually your child is actually bored. And boarding schools, if nothing else, a change of scenery might help them unleash that potential. Also, if you feel that athletically, they might become someone who could be recruited, that obviously would be reason to either stay or go, right? That's something to factor in. But academically, I mean, you can tell, are they good with time management? One of the biggest challenges academically in boarding school is that you are managing your time. And even Hong Kong moms who are like the most, I think, like, amazing time managers, especially those who have multiple kids, cannot control their child's schedule, right? So you can give suggestions, but is your child actually going to listen to you? So I think you can tell if normally they're already always like cutting it close, they can't hand in things on time, and having raised them, that they're not great at time management yet. That means if they arrive freshman year, the grades start to matter sophomore year, right? So they have 1 year to adjust. And if they've waited a year and they're applying, they're entering sophomore year, they have to hit the ground running. And so there's that. And the other thing is their English level. So if they're still, like let's say they transition from a local school to an international school in grade 7, like I transitioned grade 8. So that's not uncommon, but they may not have had enough years in a more native English environment to be able to thrive academically in a boarding school where everyone is pretty much, not everyone, but majority of students are native speakers and they're the academically strongest students from that country. So, you have to be, I think your language and your writing skills have to be quite strong if you were to predict whether they will do well. Of course, if you are more of a STEM student, you can still do very well if you know that is the area you want to focus on. And as I said, that might be a reason to choose boarding school, because you can focus and not do the IB where your STEM strong child will also have to do 2 languages, humanities, and all of that.
I've seen a lot of parents have sent their final goals are the boarding school in US, UK, but they will usually send their child to a international school in Hong Kong first before going to boarding school. So how can we manage this decision? Like going to boarding school directly? Or it's a stepping stone going to the international school first?
So in fact, the title sort of assumes that you're choosing one or the other, but actually far more common is to first go to international school and to kind of adjust, which is why I share my background, because that's kind of the kind of increased controlled release of your child. So I think that it's also related to the bored but brilliant thing. So if you're in a local school and you can tell your child is kind of like either struggling, because sometimes they're struggling because they're just not like test-taking machines. They're people who can read, who write, who are creative, but they just don't do well on written tests. And a local school, that's just the rhythm of life. That is an everyday challenge. So I think that would be sort of very good reasons to go to international school and to get used to the more discussion-based, project-oriented approach. The other thing to think about is whether your child is very actively contributing to the community. So we work with some kids, say from DGS, who are like, you know, leading their choir and their schools that are already doing these amazing competitions, and in the local circuit, they're doing really well, athletically as well, and academically, they're kind of top of their class. If they switch to a boarding an international school, they may not adjust immediately. So they may be actually less competitive academically. And those schools usually actually have very strong English. So I wouldn't say they're at a huge disadvantage in terms of the English preparation, whereas they may take a little while to adjust and then be a little less competitive. Because let's say you enter, like I did, grade 9 high school, and then I applied to enter grade 10. I basically had like a month to get to know my teachers before they were writing recommendations for me in high school, right? So you kind of have to shine quickly, or like I said, hit the ground running. So a lot of this has to do with how well your child is doing, where they're at. And when I say well, it's academically, but also socially, and whether they're like actively a part of their community. Do they love their school? Are they like joining clubs, maybe even leading clubs? Those are very good signs that they have strong roots, and you may not want to uproot them for 2 years and then switch schools again. But if they're more like, oh, they're kind of happy-go-lucky, they can thrive anywhere, or they're unhappy, then of course, it's worth taking that risk in a way. You could say it's a risk, or rather the unknown, right? Yeah.
What are some schools you just mentioned? Is it the boarding school is coming over to Hong Kong?
So I've heard that there are boarding schools that are considering doing that. And there are also universities that offer, like, I mean, CTY is a very well-known one where they offer programs in Hong Kong. There are more universities and schools doing it in mainland China than in Hong Kong, but I think that they also realize, in terms of numbers, actually, I will share a number. When it comes to the US, Hong Kong numbers, even after COVID, rising, right? So Hong Kong and China look like we are amazingly strong at entering UK boarding schools. And so sorry, why was I talking about that? You were asking me, summer programs, yes, sorry. So I think that the schools do want to reach out and recruit. As soon as I think they are allowed to travel, they will be coming to recruit. And like I said, I've heard several boarding schools say that they want to run summer programs, maybe in partnerships with schools existing in Hong Kong. But I don't know yet. So I think you just kind of have to put ears to the ground.
It is for grade.
Summer schools can start very young, but most people do summer school around grade 5 and above. Yeah, before then, it's usually not a live-in camp, right? Because it's usually a day camp. Starting grade 6, there are more boarding camps, yes. But definitely there are online programs that high school students can take that mirror what would happen if you were able to go. Academically, at least. And there is that community online. I think the past year has really led to a huge leap forward in terms of the technology for online learning. So in terms of even the social element of learning. So might still be worth it to do a course online. Yeah. Do we have any online questions as well?
No, we don't have any online questions.
Sure.
If there are no more
I will jump to. Oh, I guess, okay, what I wanted to say here with the stats, since there aren't any more questions, I'll just show you these, just to compare the destinations of UK versus US versus Hong Kong schools. Right, so you can see very impressive Oxbridge destinations for the top UK schools. I mean, I'm choosing specific schools just as a sample, right? This is not comprehensive. And then US boarding schools and then Hong Kong schools. And this is, yeah, to show their US destination of the same thing. These things change, but so this is like broadly sense. Okay. Since we're wrapping up, I want to share that Baker & Bloom offers boarding school admissions and college admissions counseling. We also help kids transition from local to international schools with a test that they have to take, that preparation. But I think more importantly, if you want to do either international or boarding school, having a strong foundation in English reading and writing matters the most. And we have a wonderful inspired reading and writing program that's not designed with a test in mind, but really I'm a literature major. We designed this curriculum to promote the appreciation of literature, the command of language, and being strong readers and writers, whatever you choose to pursue in the future is going to be a huge advantage. And also, just makes you enjoy life more. But these are the things which is, I think, pretty standard for college and boarding school admissions counseling, help with the essay, school selection, interview prep, resume, and portfolio creation, but which is something we're quite, I think we specialize in, portfolios. And because we're small, we're very strong at tailoring our coaching to individual interests. Because we're about cultivating creativity, that's what we love doing the most, right? So if you like dance and you like STEM, how can we bring the two together to design something that relates to like tracking your biometrics? Or if you like health and you're interested in government, can we do something related to think tanks and public policy? So we're really good at that type of project coaching. And then of course, as I said, academic and test prep coaching as well. And Karen, Ms. Karen Kwok is our U.S. boarding school counselor. She's a graduate of Taft, which is a top boarding school as well. We were at Harvard around the same time. She also went to business school at Harvard, and she's had over 5 years of experience with admissions, and her students have done very well. As a psych major, Karen is also a very empathetic and a very understanding counselor who can motivate kids, but also not give them undue pressure. Mr. Rory Riley is our UK counselor, and Rory is fantastic. I mean, he is so knowledgeable. He has because he taught in a number of schools, including King's College School of Wimbledon, King's School Canterbury. He really has a network among these schools, and he was the registrar, so basically head of admissions for the King's School for over a decade. So he really understands the thinking behind the admissions. And, just to share a little bit, our results in terms of university, and we should have added Stanford as well. We had 2 students get into Stanford last year. But anyways, we offer 30-minute complimentary consultations. And also, you're welcome to just chat with me right now if you have some questions about that, and to drop by Baker & Bloom to find us. And the courses that I was describing, like the Inspired Reader and Writer course, which covers different genres, which is research-based. Our primary program head is one of 3 registered reading specialists in Hong Kong, Ms. Rebecca Bush. So our curriculum is a really well designed, and it targets the specific needs, the weaknesses of Hong Kong students, but also really looks ahead at how can literature be fun? How can reading and writing be useful, even if you don't like poetry, right? So we do history, biography, science, literacy across subjects. And so do check out our courses. We have holiday courses as well. This is what I was describing, teaching them strategies, not just formula. And yeah, so definitely would welcome any questions related to our courses and our different offerings. And thank you so much for spending time on a Saturday, and hope you all have a fun Halloween weekend. And if any of you here would like to chat afterwards, I'm very happy to stay and talk.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
To introduce our U.S. college counselor who's
Yes.
here as well. Jennifer.
Jennifer, would you like to
Yes,
step into camera so people can see your
introduce
face?
yourself very quickly.
Okay.
So if anyone has any questions about U.S. college admissions, you can talk to her afterwards as well.
Yeah, so I'm Jennifer Lee, and I'm a Wellesley and Harvard Graduate School of Education alum, and I have been in Hong Kong. This is my 5th year. I've worked in at Victoria Shanghai Academy as one of their university guidance counselor, at Shanghai American School on the Puxi campus. I'm actually Korean American, so I don't speak any Cantonese or Mandarin, but I am collaborating with Baker and Bloom because philosophically, I think our values and educational values align, and because of COVID, I am here, and so I'm going to be collaborating with the company.
So we're
So
very
yeah.
excited to meet and find Jennifer, who offers such a wealth of experience with US college admissions as a school, especially from a school counselor perspective, where you work with over 100 students.
Oh,
every
and
day.
I'm still reading for UCLA, so yeah, it's been like
Right.
11 years.
So she's still reading applications from
Yes,
UCLA.
All right.
Okay.
Yes.
I
Thank
will-
you very much.
Yep. Thank you.
Studying.
Oh, really?
Oh,